It includes a collection of research, people who work in research, education, teaching, application of policy, and various other areas. And many of us have various ground level political engagements, which we bring to our discussions and try to develop our ideas from there. So a lot of what I'm going to be presenting today is going to be coming from things that have been seen on the ground over the past 2 years. Next slide. So before we begin, I'm going to kind of start with a story, which our paper starts off with as well, which is has its origins in Sufi lore, which illustrates what we call common sense. So the story begins that a person is coming out of one person is coming out of a building and sees somebody crawling around the ground looking for something. The first person asks the second person, "What are you looking for?" The second person says, "I'm looking for my keys." The first person says, "Where did you lose your keys?" And the second person says, "Somewhere down the street." The first person says, "Well, why are you looking here?" And the second person says, "Well, this is where the light is, so this is the only place I can look at." This is a story that, in some sense, illustrates the conflict that exists between what we call the common person and the expert. The expert is usually someone who's trained in a very rigorous domain, especially in the context of mathematical modeling and mathematics, where things are supposed to be explicitly defined, and therefore is very limited in terms of where they can look. They really can look only where the light is, even if they're searching for keys that are far away. But it always looks like a very strange exercise to somebody who's actually concerned about where the keys are, because if the keys are a road down the line, how do you know where that is? In some sense, this discussion is like the discussion between somebody who is inebriated and somebody who's sober. The inebriated person says a lot of things, which may seem incoherent to the person who's sober, but a sense of intention, a sense of definiteness, a sense of purpose might be there for the person who is inebriated. But the person who is sober keeps trying to make sense of what that person is saying, not able to really understand what's going on. This could be you could say the expert is the inebriated person, or the person who is not part of that disciplinary expertise is the inebriated one, because sometimes to the common person, what the expert says sounds incoherent except for very specific things. And on the other side, when the expert tries to give prescriptions to the non-expert, the non-expert's behavior can seem quite arbitrary and incoherent, vague. So there's constantly this effort that's being made on both sides of trying to convert the language back and forth. And this is something that has really played out in terms of our ground experiences in the past year, and we would like to talk about it. So I'll just hand to Manish, where he'll explain how the mathematical modeling over the past year evolved a certain kind of discourse and a certain kind of common sense, which we saw in India. Manish?
Hi, thanks, Kishore. In context of India, there were a lot of pandemic models that were developed, but two models stood apart from this whole exercise were from government sponsored models. So, and their outcomes were in a way they tried to create a sense among the common people was that the lockdown, specifically the national lockdown earlier last year, was actually control the pandemic and its growth, uh, which was criticized all over the place because of it was unplanned and a lot of other problems and issues that arose because of that. For example, the deadly migrant crisis. The second common sense that it tried to create is it's tried to predict, like that's basically the objective of the model is to track the pandemic. And what do you mean by tracking is basically looking at the current course, and based on that we forecast or predict the future growth, or we can identify when and what intensity the waves would be. And there's another common sense which is like prevailed all over the place is these modelers who develop the SAI model and Sutra model. They all of them are computer scientists, and they're not really health experts. They don't know the ground realities in that way. But in the news reports, in everywhere, they are being called as health experts. And so, in the sense, like what we get, what a common person is get is that the model is and the models are giving some expertise, and sometimes we are led to believe that the results are definite and that is going to happen. And for the common public, it's not really we're not access to the different scenarios that this model is trying to use and predict based on those scenarios what will happen. A little bit about what these models are. Both the models, SAIR and Sutra models, they are data driven. They are compartmental models like any other epidemiological model, SIR and SEIR. But these two models are different from the other models in the way that they incorporate the asymptomatic patient or undetected or untested population in their models. Sutra, which has recently got infamous for wrongly predicting or wrongly assessing the second wave and its impact. Second wave, I mean, which I believe everyone know, it was. I have no word for how to describe it, but there was a sense around May and April and May last year that these health experts who are basically computer scientists, they predicted the duration and the time of the second wave and its growth. But what basically trumped their prediction was the infrastructural issues. Let's say, for example, like lack of hospitals and oxygen cylinders and so on. So, on that note, let's see what Sutra model is. So it's a screenshot of, let's say, publicly available dashboard uh, where we see very nicely simulated and model projections. It doesn't show any projection, maybe for a few weeks, but not beyond that. But the problem with this model is that it does not. I mean, from a modeling perspective, also, it does not show any other scenarios, let's say optimistic scenario or worst case scenario, which was in a way realized in the second wave. So I'll stop here and give the floor to Kishore to further illustrate our point. Thank you.
So the concern about the Sutra model was that in some sense it was creating a discourse amongst the people about how and where and why and how the government was to manage the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. But on top of this, we had many other issues that were coming up on the ground. Can you get the next slide? So in some sense, there was a tale of two economies. In every story, there were kind of two sides that we had to worry about. One was the story of the rich, the other was the story of the poor. For example, when we're talking about the concern about the economy, we could be talking about the poor migrant labor that was trying to go home. We could also be talking about the profits of the business person that was coming in. And often these two things were posed against each other. We were working at a time when there were actually legislations that were getting passed in certain states and protests that would have to come in response to that, talking about the lengthening of the working hours or how to enforce worker discipline after they come home. In the state that I am from, Karnataka, there were a lot of migrant workers who had to leave the place. And there was a lot of discussion that was at least happening in our state legislature about how to make sure they don't leave and make sure they come back if they do leave. So it was a very draconian discourse that was going on. So in this context, we have to pay attention. If we're concerned about the political dimensions of the COVID pandemic, it's not just enough to talk about the discourses or the policies, but also what was happening with the working class around this point in time. So in this context, we'll be talking about two different models. One that was used to try to determine the minimum wage and the politics around that. And the second is a model that tries to relate against the consumption patterns of the working class through institutions of credit. Next slide. So even before the pandemic occurred, there were debates about the way in which the Indian minimum wage was getting calculated. This current government came into power saying that they would make doing business easier. They would try to streamline laws and try to make things easier for people to do business, but also with platitudes that would try to claim that this was going to be a win for the working class as well. One of the things that came up, which was passed just the year before the pandemic had come up, was the Code of Wages bill, a bill that would make various other acts and bills redundant and and amongst many things, set a new standard for trying to calculate the minimum wage. There are many promises that were being made in the bill saying that this would somehow help the unorganized sector and that this bill was somehow more culturally sensitive and that somehow it was going to be more scientific. So we're going to have to kind of unpack what this bill is because it's not as simple as saying it's good or bad, but it does change the terms of discourse. And in doing so, it does change what we think the working class is entitled to. Next slide. So if we look at the formulas that were proposed for the minimum wage after the passing of this bill, as compared to the older system which was going up, the pie does increase. So they say that according to the old system, according to 2019 prices, the minimum wage was 175 rupees per day. Now it comes to about 350 rupees per day. It's about a double increase in this. But at the same time, the metrics that are used in order to determine what the minimum wage is started to change. So in the old system, there was an understanding that the local prices for food, clothing, and rent would determine 55% of what the minimum wage is. And on top of that, there was supposed to be an addition, it's scaled so that the prices of these things would be 55%. And then there would be the additional 20 and 25% are supposed to be earmarked for what are called essential and non-essential commodities beyond this. So essential commodities would be things like electricity, fuel, transport, etc. And non-essential part, which was considered to be enough for a dignified life. The idea that a person earning a minimum wage should be able to, in principle, have a social life, a basic frugal existence beyond bare minimum. So the minimum wage was designed and calculated to ensure that a single earner could support a family of four with all of these things. The new system was considered to be more invested in survey work. So what it did was it increased the dietary allotment portion, which means that instead of simply saying that the old system, which would have talked about the food requirements entirely in terms of calories, the new system would have included other nutrients as well, like protein and fat. And when it was the essential and non-essential parts, rather being earmarked as a constant 20 and 25% of the income, were actually earmarked based off of a basket of commodities, based off of a national sampling. The essential components were pegged to what the median earner spends on, and the non-essential parts were pegged to what people at the poverty line would be pegged to. We do a slight deconstruction in the paper, but just as a focus to take home when looking at this graph, what you see is even though the pie is getting bigger, the assumptions about the minimum wage earners are changing. You can see that essential commodities like food, clothing, housing, and others now dominate what the worker is expected to spend on, and so now that comprises 90%, as opposed to earlier when it would comprise 75%. So while the total amount that is being allotted is actually increasing, there is a new set of assumptions that are underlying the basic understanding of what a minimum wage earner is supposed to earn. This, of course, becomes very important in the context of the pandemic, when there's a breakdown in the public economy. and people are now struggling in order to make ends meet. Could we go to the next slide? Yes, right. So even though that the amount promised would be doubled, we just have to remember that the 2019 Act has not yet been implemented. So effectively saying that the government has made a new assessment of what they think the basic needs of the workers are. They've, in some sense, disregarded certain aspects and tried to justify new aspects using surveys as opposed to a normative approach. But even though their conclusions turned out to be inconvenient, that means that they have had to spend more on minimum wages. They've decided that they would forestall and not implement these sorts of things. So in a year when people needed higher incomes, these things wouldn't have come into practice. It was almost as if they're biding their time. Remember, just before the COVID pandemic, India had experienced a slowing down of an economy already. There was actually a 40-year high in unemployment rates that have already been existing. And they said even at that point in time that they don't think this is the time that they could feasibly implement the law that they themselves had just passed. So so here we see the two dimensions of the politics coming out. Number one, we're changing the terms at which we're talking about the working class. And second, even when it becomes inconvenient, we'll ignore our own principles. So that's on minimum wage. Now I'm going to present a model that talks about more the consumption side of things, and that's in the context of microcredit. For those of you who don't know, microcredit is a scheme of credit provisioning, which was supposed to be oriented towards the working class. It's basically you give loans without collateral, smaller amounts at really high interest rates. It was a model that has really come into the Indian landscape through the 1990s, and initially was just, or actually even now it's proposed as something that is supposed to empower women specifically from marginalized segments of society. What's often missed out in the story of microcredit, however, is that the reason why women from marginalized portions of society are taken up is because these are people who have very little and can be easily coerced through social mechanisms in order to repay their debts. They lack the social infrastructure in order to fight back because because it's not like they live almost on a day-to-day existence, and they're very prone to certain forms of abuses and harassments that exist. So in the COVID pandemic specifically, there was a crisis in the microcredit sector. Many people who just couldn't access their daily wages, and in the context of a place where like things were really breaking down, people who were engaged in petty business could not engage in petty business. People who had to work every day could not work every day, and it was just a record number of defaulting loans that were happening. This is when the government started recognizing that there was a crisis in the microcredit sector. And there was a report that was even published by the Reserve Bank of India saying that there needs to be high reforms in order to protect the microcredit sector. Basically, the concern was that banks were going to be losing money, and not the fact that people were getting to a point where they couldn't they weren't able to earn enough the same wages as before. So there was a whole question about how we're going to make sure borrowers start paying back their debt rather than a concern for the borrowers themselves. Next slide. So while we can talk about the social institutions of microcredit, right now we're just going to focus on what the mathematical discourse and presumptions exist within a credit borrowing system. So this is something that comes from a paper by Samuelson, equation that tries to model how to prevent default or how to optimize in context of default. Now, the model is based off of a stochastic process, and the stochastic process is almost a mathematical iterative system that tries to forget the past in predicting the future. You remember, so what you do today is kind of determined on what you did yesterday, but not much further than that. The stochastic process tries to incorporate as little of the history as possible and makes a prediction into the future. In some sense, this process, even though it's based off of an understanding of memorylessness, it does incorporate a certain level of learning. So like there's a trajectory that gets mapped based off of what the previous conditions were. And this trajectory, in some sense, captures, I think, what Samuelson himself points out, a certain kind of penalty factor, a certain kind of disciplining that's coming into the working class. But it's put into this very nice mathematical equation, so it's something that we kind of overlook when we look at it. It's a simple delta that doesn't say much. So the model, while it claims to be based off of memorylessness, it actually works based off of themes of guilt, shame, fear that a person is dealing with, encoding it into a nice mathematical formula. Next slide. So we've just now made a critical analysis of three types of mathematical models that we know that were affecting the working class in a strong way over the past year. But we also need to get to the point of how to imagine the alternatives. The alternatives, of course, cannot be imagined simply by reconfiguring the mathematical exercise, not just by simply adding a parameter here, or seeing how a mathematician could do it better. It's important to understand these exercises as inherently political, and therefore try to put these exercises in the context of the existing polity. Next slide. So for each of these models, we do suggest maybe not a different model, but a different approach that could be applied to each of them. In the context of the COVID pandemic modeling, it was clear that all the modeling was doing was limiting the discourse and trying to give only and kind of give a constant apology for what the government had already been doing. It would keep changing parameters based off of what was going. But instead, a mathematical model has to be part of the public imagination. A mathematical model, if it's going to be used for policy, it also needs to be presented in such a way that the public is explained what different options are, what different scenarios could be happening, allowing for the possibility of a certain kind of public engagement. It has to incorporate concerns that are coming from the ground and somehow and coming up on this. So it's not simply about telling people that the pandemic is evolving this way, or there may be a wave here or there. But if they really want to protect their children, or if they need to preserve their livelihoods, these are all the consequences that are coming with it, and that these are also not the perfect solutions. These are not the perfect assessment as well. These are the educated guesses of experts coming from certain directions in order to make that. That was something that was clearly missing in the Indian context, and that was something that would be different in how we would want it to be done. In the context of the minimum wage model, it becomes an alluring habit to start thinking about minimum wages, trying to guarantee a very basic provisioning for the working class. But in some sense, it's not really that. Minimum wage is supposed to be something that consolidates the interests and needs of the working class in a country. So our understanding of an alternative when it comes to the issue of the minimum wage, we may want to take a page from the thoughts of Martin Luther King Jr. Towards the end of his life, he kind of went away from the civil rights narrative that he was working on for the earlier part of his activist career, and he started asking questions about where the movement should go forward from here. And he said that, especially in the context of racism and poverty and violence, it's really important to start talking about kind of a basic minimum that could be there for everybody. He was talking, the policies he was considering were things like a universal right to housing, or a universal basic income for the bottom half or the poorest half. And it was an interesting discussion that he puts into it, because he's talking about consolidating the objective conditions of the working class rather than having piecemeal activities that kind of look at different aspects of it. Try to find things that kind of everyone is concerned about and bring that together, and have the stance of poverty alleviation being linked up with a certain kind of political imagination that could come up. So if we wanted to change the discussion on the minimum wage, it would be we would want something closer to this. On the question of microcredit and debt, we know that if there is a crisis in the economy, it's important that we don't think that debt relations continue expanding and increasing as it was before. There needs to be a serious discussion about what the conditions of a debt erasure campaign. especially in context of crisis, especially in a country like India, where you have a whole history of violence being associated with debt, but not just maybe not just in the context of a crisis. Maybe it should be seen as a regular thing. Maybe there should be a constant campaign that goes on. But if you do this, of course, we'd ask the question: what would debt and credit relationships be like? So it might foster an even more radical set of questions as well. What is the relationship of credit and debt? Then what is the relationship between private property and those who do not own property? These are the kinds of things that we'd want to move towards. Um, Next slide. So to conclude, as we concluded in the paper, there is this story that goes on that is a story of the scholar trying to cross a river. The scholar crosses the river and has a chat with the boatman. When he talks to the boatman, he says, "What do you?" He asks the question about whether they've studied math or whether they've studied science or poetry or philosophy. And each time the boatman says he hasn't studied any of these things, the scholar replies, "You've wasted your childhood. You wasted half your life." However, an accident comes to the boat and the boat begins to sink. And while the boat is sinking, the boatman asks the scholar if he's ever learned how to swim. And the scholar says no, to which the boatman replies, "Well, you've wasted all of your life up till now because now your life is over." This discourse is kind of repeated even often today, but sometimes it feels like it's even more ridiculous than that. As we see in the comic book, there's a boat where there's a hole in it and the boat is sinking, and there are people who are working to solve the problem, and there are people who are commenting. This description kind of captures the situation that we're in today. So I'll end with this, and yes, we can continue from here.